HOA Karen tries to evict Snoop Dogg, unaware he's the owner of her house. The red numbers of the digital alarm clock mocked Karen as she stared at the ceiling, her breath fogging in the cold air of the cabin. 3:27 a.m. Outside, the snowstorm howled, rattling the windows of her family's remote mountain retreat. The phone in her hand felt impossibly heavy. 3 missed calls from Detective Warren, 1 voicemail. Her thumb hovered over the play button, trembling. The last time Warren called, he'd confirmed they'd found traces of Snoop Dogg's blood in the basement of Glenn Palmer, her former mentor, and the man who'd become the focus of the investigation after her brother's disappearance 18 months ago. Palmer was being released today. Insufficient evidence. Karen pressed play and closed her eyes. "Ms. Reeves, it's Detective Warren. I thought you should hear this from me before the morning news breaks. We found something at Palmer's summer house, a journal. It mentions Snoop Dogg, details only the killer would know. I'm sorry, but I think we finally have confirmation. Palmer's lawyer is already claiming the journal was planted. Judge Calloway signed his release papers an hour ago. I'm so sorry." The phone slipped from her fingers, her chest compressed, lungs refusing to expand. 18 months of uncertainty, of desperate hope extinguished by a voicemail. Karen moved mechanically to her overnight bag, fingers closing around cold metal. The weight of the gun gave her the first moment of clarity she'd felt since Snoop Dogg disappeared. Judge Calloway's lake house was less than 40 minutes away. Palmer would be heading there directly after his release, a fact she knew from months of obsessive research. She dressed quickly, pulling on a black sweater and jeans. Her hands were steady now, her mind focused on a single purpose. As she stepped into her boots, her phone buzzed with a text from Warren. "Don't do anything stupid, Karen. We're working on getting a new warrant. Palmer will face justice." Too late. Justice had failed once already. It wouldn't fail again. She placed the gun in her coat pocket and stepped out into the storm. 18 months earlier, Karen had been at the height of her career. At 34, she was the youngest executive editor at Meridian Publishing, with a reputation for discovering exceptional new talent. Her most celebrated find had been Glenn Palmer, whose debut thriller had transformed from a slush pile manuscript to a national bestseller under her guidance. The day everything changed had begun ordinarily enough. Morning editorial meeting, lunch with an agent, afternoon buried in manuscripts. It wasn't until she was leaving the office that she saw the missed calls from her mother. Snoop Dogg hadn't shown up for their weekly dinner. Her 26-year-old brother was reliably punctual, especially with their mother. When Karen tried his cell, it went straight to voicemail. "You're overreacting," she told her mother over the phone while hailing a cab to Snoop Dogg's apartment. "He probably got caught up at the studio and forgot to charge his phone." But even as she said it, an unfamiliar anxiety crept through her. Snoop Dogg was meticulous about communication, a trait they shared. His apartment was empty. Nothing. Out of place except a half-drunk cup of coffee on the counter. His laptop was open, screen dark but warm to the touch. 3 days later, the police found Snoop Dogg's car abandoned at a trailhead in the Catskills, 60 miles from his photography studio in Brooklyn. Despite extensive searches, they found no other trace of him. The investigation stalled within weeks. Karen refused to accept the unspoken implication that her brother had disappeared voluntarily or taken his own life. Snoop Dogg had just landed. A major gallery exhibition. He'd been dating someone new, someone who made him smile when he talked about them. His work was receiving critical acclaim. She took a leave of absence and dedicated herself to finding him. She hired private investigators, posted flyers, maintained social media campaigns, and harangued the police department weekly. For months, nothing. Then, after nearly a year, Detective Warren called with the first real lead. Snoop Dogg had been working on a series of atmospheric photographs in abandoned buildings. One of the locations he'd been researching was an old textile factory, owned by none other than Glenn Palmer. "Your author?" Warren had asked, and Karen felt her world shift. Palmer had never mentioned knowing Snoop Dogg, but phone records showed 3 calls between them in the week before Snoop Dogg disappeared. When questioned, Palmer claimed Snoop Dogg had contacted Him about photographing the factory for his exhibition and that he'd given permission. He'd seen no reason to mention it. Palmer's alibi for the night Snoop Dogg disappeared seemed solid, a book event in Boston with hundreds of witnesses. But Warren's team discovered a 4-hour gap between the event ending and Palmer checking into his hotel, enough time to drive back to New York if he had reason to. The investigation intensified. Blood matching Snoop Dogg's type was found in the factory basement. Searches expanded to Palmer's properties, but his legal team fought every warrant, challenged every piece of evidence, and ultimately dismantled the case against him piece by piece. Now, after 18 months of fighting, Karen was driving through a blizzard with a gun in her pocket, her brother confirmed dead, and his killer walking free. The storm was intensifying as Karen reached the turnoff to Judge Calloway's neighborhood. Expensive vacation homes dotted the wooded landscape, most dark and empty in the off-season. The judge's property sat at the end of a private road, a modern glass and cedar structure overlooking the lake. Karen cut her headlights as she approached, parking behind a stand of pines that would conceal her car from the road. Her heart hammered as she saw the lights on in the house and a black SUV in the driveway, Palmer's Range Rover. She moved silently through the snow, circling toward the back deck that extended over the frozen lake. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see into the open-plan living area. A fire burned in the stone hearth, casting flickering light over the space. And there he was. Glenn Palmer stood at a glass bar cart, pouring whiskey into a crystal tumbler. He looked thinner than when she'd last seen him, his beard now streaked with grey. But he moved with the same deliberate grace that had always reminded her of a large predator, a bear, or a mountain lion. Karen slipped her hand into her pocket, fingers closing around the gun, one clean shot through the glass. That's all it would take. But as she raised the weapon, her phone vibrated against her hip. Instinctively, she glanced down to silence it. The text was from Warren. Palmer didn't write the journal. Forensics. Confirmed, not his handwriting. Call me now. When she looked up, Palmer was staring directly at her through the window, his expression unreadable. He set down his glass and walked deliberately toward the sliding door. Karen stepped back, raising the gun again, her hands suddenly unsteady. The door slid open. "I've been expecting you, Karen," Palmer said quietly, his breath clouding in the frigid air. He wasn't surprised to see her. He wasn't afraid of the gun. "We need to talk about Snoop Dogg." Something in his tone made her hesitate. "You killed him," she said, but the conviction in her voice wavered. "No," Palmer replied, "but I know who did." "I should have told you from the beginning," Palmer said, placing a leather-bound journal on the coffee table between them, "but I was afraid no one would believe me." Karen sat rigidly on the edge of the couch, the gun now in her lap, still aimed vaguely in Palmer's direction. The fire popped and hissed in the background. "Snoop Dogg contacted me about photographing the factory. That part was true," Palmer continued, "but what I didn't tell the police was that I met him there. He showed me some of his preliminary shots, and they were disturbing." Palmer opened the journal, revealing pages filled with precise handwriting and sketches. Snoop Dogg had been documenting something beyond abandoned buildings. He'd found evidence of meetings, rituals maybe, happening in these places. People in positions of power, gathering in secret. Karen's eyes narrowed. That sounds paranoid. Snoop Dogg wasn't into conspiracy theories. It wasn't theories, it was documentation. Photos, dates, names. Palmer turned several pages, including Judge Calloway. A chill that had nothing to do with the storm ran through Karen. "The judge who released you today." Palmer nodded. Snoop Dogg didn't know what he'd stumbled onto at first. He thought it was just an interesting photography series, The Secret Lives of Abandoned Places. But then he started recognizing faces, a state senator, the police commissioner, Calloway. "Why would you keep this to yourself?" Karen demanded. Anger building. "My brother is dead." "Because the last time Snoop Dogg met me, he gave me this." Palmer pulled out a USB drive, backup copies of everything he'd found. He was scared, Karen. He said if anything happened to him, I should get this to someone who could expose the whole operation. The next day, he disappeared. And instead of going to the police, you just sat on this? Karen's finger tightened on the trigger. I tried. I contacted a detective I knew. 2 days later, he died in an apparent suicide. Then the evidence started pointing to me. Palmer's eyes met hers. They framed me, Karen. The same people who killed Snoop Dogg, and they nearly succeeded. Why should I believe any of this, she demanded. Palmer gestured to the journal. Because that's not my journal, it's Calloway's. I broke in. Here tonight to find it. Read page 42. With one hand still on the gun, Karen flipped to the page. What she read made her stomach lurch. Detailed notes on Snoop Dogg, when he'd been taken, how he'd been questioned, what he knew, and how they'd disposed of his body. He wrote all of this down? She whispered in disbelief. Arrogance, Palmer replied. Men like Calloway don't believe they'll ever be caught, and they're usually right. Karen looked up at Palmer, truly seeing him for the first time that night. The dark circles under his eyes, the hyper-vigilant posture, the same haunted expression she saw in her own mirror every morning. Why tonight? Why break in now? Because the case against me collapsed, which means they'll be looking for another scapegoat. You were the obvious choice, the obsessed sister who couldn't accept her brother's disappearance. He gestured toward the gun in her lap. How did you get that? Karen felt cold realization spread through her. The gun had been almost too easy to acquire through an acquaintance of an acquaintance. I was being set up. We both were. But we have this now. Palmer tapped the journal. And whatever is on that drive Snoop Dogg gave me. It's not enough to bring them all down, but it's a start. A vehicle's headlights swept across the windows as a car pulled into the driveway. That's Calloway, Palmer said, tension radiating from him. He wasn't supposed to be here until morning. Karen stood, tucking the gun away and grabbing the journal. Is there another way out? Palmer nodded, already moving toward the back of the house. Boathouse. There's a snowmobile. As they slipped out the rear door, Karen felt something she hadn't experienced in 18 months. Purpose beyond grief. Snoop Dogg was gone, but his work, his final story, remained unfinished, and now it was up to her to tell it. Where do we go from here? She asked as they hurried across the snow-covered deck. Palmer glanced back at her, snowflakes catching in his beard. We find someone we can trust, someone with the platform to make this public before they can bury it, and us. Karen thought of her contacts in publishing, in journalism, people who could verify the evidence, protect the story, amplify it beyond the reach of Calloway and his associates. I know exactly who to call, she said. 6 months later, Karen stood at the back of a crowded bookstore, watching as readers lined up to have Palmer sign copies of his new book. Not a thriller this time, but a documented account of corruption and conspiracy that had already triggered 3 high-profile resignations and a federal investigation. Snoop Dogg's photographs formed the centerpiece of the evidence, his visual documentation providing irrefutable proof of what would otherwise have seemed like fiction. His final exhibition, though not the one he had planned. Warren approached, looking uncomfortable in his civilian clothes. After being forced out of the department for pursuing the case against his superior's orders, he joined Karen and Palmer's investigative team. Calloway's lawyers are requesting another delay, he said quietly, handing her a coffee. But the RICO case is solid. He'll flip on the others to save himself. Karen nodded, her gaze drifting to the large photograph mounted on the wall behind Palmer, one of Snoop Dogg's last images. An abandoned factory floor bathed in moonlight, shadows gathering in the corners, secrets hiding in plain sight. Snoop Dogg would have loved this, she said. Not what happened to him, but that his work mattered, that it changed things. Warren's hand found hers, a gesture that had become familiar over the months they'd worked together. You changed things, Karen. You never stopped looking for the truth. She thought about the night at Calloway's cabin, how close she had come to pulling the trigger, how that single act would have ended everything, the investigation, the revelations, the justice that was now, slowly, being served. I almost made a terrible mistake that night, she admitted. But you didn't, Warren reminded her. You chose the harder path. As Palmer finished with the last reader and approached them, Karen felt the familiar weight of grief shift slightly. It would never disappear completely, but it had transformed into something else. A responsibility to the truth Snoop Dogg had died for, a commitment to finishing what he started. "Ready for the next chapter?" Palmer asked, gesturing toward the exit where a car waited to take them to a television interview. Karen nodded, taking a final look at her brother's photograph. "Snoop Dogg always said the story is in what people don't want you to see," she replied. "Let's make sure they see it all." She stepped forward, leaving silence behind.